So welcome everybody to results training. This is core module 4, and we're talking about this morning about standards unit modifications. And this session is going to be at a very high level, just to provide you with an overview about SU modifications. My name is Michin Choi, and I'll be your presenter today. I'm a consultant working for Resource Practices Branch for Results. The person that's responsible for results her name is Carolyn Wood. And so during the course of the session, you're encouraged to ask questions, but if there's questions that I cannot answer, then what I'll do is I'll table them and confer with Caroline, and we'll send an email back with the response to those unanswered questions. So today what's going to happen is that if you do have questions, if you have a microphone on your headset, you're welcome to ask questions using a microphone. Most people use chat, so you could type your questions in the chat box on the far right-hand side of your toolbar. If you do ask questions, kindly do direct the questions to the entire audience so they may read your question. At the end of this session, what happens is that if you can complete the evaluation form to provide us with feedback, so this way we can actually improve on our training delivery. If you are new to results and you haven't had access yet, what happens is that we are requiring users be familiar with results, so they have to complete a test. So there's a website link that's sent to you 24 hours after completion of the course. The way the testing website works is that there's two types of tests that you have to take. You choose one of the two, depending on who you are, whether you're a submitter or you're a approver. And in order to complete the test successfully, it covers off 6 modules of materials. So what happens is that if you're only able to attend a few of them, you can review the information on our training website on your own, but the idea is that you have to have some familiarity with results to be able to pass the test. So you need to not just this session, but multiple of other sessions as well. So just to let you know that's a new requirement that we have. And if you're involved with renewing your access, that's the same thing. You have to complete and pass the test as well. So today what we're going to cover off is I'm going to go through high-level business guidance and talk about the use of online versus ESF submissions for dealing with SU modifications. And I'm going to point to our technical documentation information and how it can help you out with dealing with anything related to SU modifications, as well as going through some of the mandatory rules that ties to standards units. And I'm going to go through some of the process and rules that are involved with how the system processes information for SUs, and then point to our help resources that are available to you to help you out if you run into problems with submitting into results. So first and foremost, results is a tracking system that tracks silviculture obligation as well as government-funded areas on the Crown land. And what happens is that in dealing with SU modifications, we're primarily dealing with legal obligations. And what happens is that there is legislative framework which requires submissions and the tracking of silviculture obligations. So there is a document on our website on the business and policy documentation link that has this document called the Results Information Submission Specifications. There's a licensee edition. There's other editions as well, one that deals with government-funded areas, one for small-scale salvage and woodlots. What you need to know is that this document, the submission specification document, is the sort of the foundation of what is required as far as submitting for results, and it has like the form and manner of submissions. So when you go into the document, it details out the policy legislation, the legislation framework, as well as what fields are mandatory information about what needs to be supplied. So it's really important for you to be familiar with these documents. These documents also gets updated once periodically. So more recently, there was changes made to the requirement for basal area reporting. So I encourage you to make sure that you're up to date with getting the most recent copy of the submission specification so that you know what the requirements are. Something that you need to know about is that Results has now only accepts information electronically. Electronic submissions come through two methods. It's either through ESF or online. You update that information. But something that you just need to know about, Results collects information for silviculture obligation or openings that dates back back to 1970s. So what happens is that we have records that are actually fairly old. And so what happens is that anything that we have in the system has been entered in and then has been converted from subsequent systems. And all these older records exist in Results. So when you're dealing with documents that are on in Results, you're dealing with old records and new records. When you're dealing with things like SU modifications, what's going to happen is that in some situations you will be making changes to older documents where the data standards and the data requirements that existed at the time may be different than what exists today. So it's just important for you to know that we are dealing with a whole continuum of records and the life cycle of these records. And so when we have a silviculture obligation, we have these openings that can last up to 20 years. So what happens is that you'll see that some pieces of information have different kinds of information depending on what we're dealing with. So today we're going to talk about SU modifications. In my previous sessions, I talk about all these different components of ESF submissions, but SU modifications are really the legal requirements for an opening. And so what happens here is that when we have an opening that, again, can span up to 20 years in terms of its life cycle, things may happen to the opening where there's a requirement to make changes to the opening. And what happens here is that you have basically both ESF and online option of making changes to those documents. What's really important is that ESF, it allows you to update information as well as providing updated maps. So anytime when we talk about ESF submissions and you need to make changes to a map, it has to come through that mechanism because that's the only way the map can come through. You have the capability of making changes to the attribute information online for standards units, but the thing is that you have to be mindful whether or not you should be doing that online or not. So in some situations, if you're making just some changes to data elements for the standards unit, then what happens is that it might be okay to make those changes online. But if you are making changes where you're adding, deleting a standards unit, merging standards unit, or new line work is provided because you need to make an amendment because some blowdown has happened, anytime you would be modifying a map, then that means that you shouldn't be doing that online. You must be doing that. You must do that through ESF. So that's kind of like the sort of baseline of making sure you understand which mechanism you should be using. In Results, we do have a reference. We have technical documentation reference website, and the technical specification is available here, where this information, if you wanted to look up information about how Results process information, you have the capability go into the technical specification to look up there's a ESF and online component where you can read up about the specific data elements of the schema, or if you were to use the online component, it would be providing you with the information organized by screens. I point people out to the technical specification because this explains to you how Results process the information. So it provides description of what the fields are, but more importantly, it talks about the conditional, like the optionality, whether it's a mandatory field, conditional field, as well as providing any validation checks that takes place. I know some people have a hard time understanding the technical aspects of this piece for Results. And all I can say is that when you're doing ESF submissions, what happens is that when you're involved with submitting, you get errors. This is really sort of the starting point of trying to decipher what was processed for that particular element to cause perhaps the error to come up. And the same applies when you're entering information online and you're getting errors, going to the screen and understanding how the information is processed. Some people have no problem going through this information on their own, while some people have a problem with understanding because it's quite technical. So, but this is ability for you to try to resolve or solve the problem on your own, short of going to our help desk people. So it's just a resource that's available for you if you are trying to decipher a problem, if you're running into problems with your submissions. So code tables are also available on here in case if you are involved with doing submissions and new to the business and need to know what the long expanded form of what the codes stand for. So they're all published. So anything that's in the code tables are identifying what the active codes are that are being used in results. And so we have also in this same website the technical documentation, a place called, it's called the Amendment Update Summary, but I call it the Standards Unit Modification Cheat Sheet. And this will be really important to you if you're involved with doing any ESF submissions, because it explains to you how to structure your ESF file when you're submitting, if you're involved with making issue modifications. What's really key here, and I will be going through this matrix in a lot more detail in the subsequent sessions, like there's an ESF session this afternoon. But the key here for you to know is that this matrix explains to you the type of action codes you'd be using to match the issue modification that you're wanting to change, as well as what is allowed in your document, whether you can add or delete an issue. And when you are involved with setting up the document, whether you are required to provide all the standards units in the submission, or if you're allowed to change or provide only the changes for the issue that you want changes to. Because the way ESFs process this information has certain assumptions based on the way the file is coming through. And so I won't go through it here because I will talk about this in a lot more detail this afternoon, but it's important for you to be aware of that if you are not attending this afternoon session, that there is this matrix that will be really crucial for knowing how to set up your ESF file. So one of the things that you need to know about is when we are involved with doing issue modifications, we have in the opening, when we have an ESF file, and if you're submitting through ESF, there's certain sort of requirements, business rules that are in play. And when a new opening is created, there's an ESF rule where at least one standard unit is created in the opening definition. And in the opening definition as well, there is a field, a data element called a site plan exempt indicator. And this indicator is used for a very specific purpose in results, in that the way results uses this, it's only for the purpose of defining the document that's being provided is a site plan or silviculture prescription. So nothing else, because there's been other people that have been trying to read too much into, oh, is it because there's a silviculture obligation or not? And it's nothing to do with that. All the site plan exempt indicator is about is whether or not we're talking about the document is going to be a site plan or a silviculture prescription that's being provided. So what happens here is that if this indicator is set to yes, results process the information or is looking for information that comes in for the standards unit, assuming that it's going to be a silviculture prescription, so it's going to be expecting all the different elements of a stocking standard to be provided. And now, in the world that we're in, everything is a silviculture. Everything is a site plan. So what happens is that the default is N, so N means it's a site plan. And so the only time you would actually set this indicator to yes is to indicate that we are dealing with a silviculture prescription amendment. And that's the only time in which this indicator would be used. So I only make sure that you need to make sure that you have this set up correctly, or the processing will be impacted by that. So in the world that we're dealing with now, for any new openings, we're dealing with site plans. So what happens is that this indicator is set to no. And what happens is that results will be looking at the document for the site plan for the standards unit, and what we will do is it will look for the submission of an approved standards regime ID. So instead of having the different elements of the stocking standards provided, a site plan has approved standards regime ID that's approved for use. So it could be either a ministry default, approved standards regime under an FDP, or an approved standards regime under an FSP. So that's just important for you to know, because if you are involved with doing silviculture prescription amendment, you have to toggle this indicator to set that to yes. So now we're going to just talk about sort of the types of documents we have in results. And so what happens is that when we deal with results, we have two methods of making changes to standards unit. We have the online capability and we have the ESF capability. When we deal with online, what's important is that the only way, whenever you're making changes online, you're essentially making changes to the attributes. So there's no changes to any maps. So this gets back to that whole idea of, if you're making changes to standards unit where you're adding or deleting or merging SUs, or you're correcting standards unit line work because you're amending, because you're changing the area caused by issues with things happen like blowdown, that kind of stuff. What happens is that you're making adjustments to the map, in which case you should be supplying that through ESF. So online can't change the spatial component. It's only allowing you to retain the existing spatial information that's there. And so if you need to supply a map, you should be doing it through ESF. But when you are online, what happens is that the system will determine whether or not you're dealing with silviculture prescription based on determining whether or not there's the existence of the standards, the standards regime ID. And what happens is that if it recognizes that you're working with a silviculture prescription document, you'll only have available to you the buttons that ties to silviculture prescriptions, and that is the correction, minor amendment, or amendment requiring an approval. So if we have a site plan, and that the way results looks at that, it defines it as the existence of a standards regime ID. If it sees that unique identifier that represents the stocking standards, it will then only make available to you the options of doing approved variation or a site plan amendment. So the buttons will appear based on the type of document it sees that standards unit as. So in the case of ESF, what happens is that when you're submitting your ESF file, what happens is that you have the ability of providing the attribute information you want to make changes to, as well as providing the spatial updates. So that's the crucial part. If you're making changes to a map, then you need to provide it through ESF. You have either options, and some licensees prefer to just do everything through ESF. But I just point to the fact that there's two options there, but one is used the most because of the fact that there's that spatial component that's required. So when you're doing an SU modification for ESF, it is actually a part of the opening definition, but what happens is that it's the use of the action code that differs. So in this table here, it just provides a breakdown of, if we're dealing with silviculture prescription document, what happens is that different action codes matches what is available as far as the different kinds of available actions you have changes you can make. So in the case of dealing with silviculture prescription, we have U for correction. It basically U is update, but it stands for correction for the silviculture prescription component. M is for minor amendment. We have the ability to do a Section 197 rollover, but the action code that's used is an M for minor amendment, and I didn't say that, but in the online component, the minor amendment button can be used for Section 197 rollover if you're choosing to do that online. And then we have a major amendment requiring approval, uses the action code of A. In the case of site plans, what happens is that you have the ability to approve variation. There's also the ability to do a Section 197 rollover, but the action code in this case would be an A, and then a site plan amendment. So these action codes are what dictates the type of changes you're going to make when you build your ESF submission. These footnotes pertained to Section 197 rollover. In order for that to happen, there's some preconditions that has to take place, and I'm going to be talking about that in slides a little bit later here. But if you are involved with doing a Section 197 rollover, just be mindful that there's extra steps that has to be taken place in order to ensure that the rollover can happen. And there shouldn't be that many of that anymore. That sort of happened in the first wave of FSPs that occurred about 5-7 years ago. So the need to do rollovers are pretty much a lot more limited than it used to be. So something that you need to be aware of is that if we are involved with doing any submissions through ESF, there's going to be a lot of rules. And that's the thing, is that Results has some edit rules that are in place to ensure good data integrity. And so a lot of these rules are actually based on when the record was created, and that has to do with the fact that some of these records are in existence prior to mandatory ESF, but we have records that date back in the early 80s, or actually earlier than that, but some of the ones that legal obligation started in 1987, 1988. So we have records that are fairly old, and so any of the older records, if they need to be changed, may have had very different data standards at the time. So what happens is that the way Results works is that since that we have that mandatory requirement for spatial information starting 2005 onwards, any newer records that is created after 2005 has to have spatial information there. So there's certain things you're not allowed to do as far as doing changes or updates, because they'll force you to have spatial. Something else that people also know is that when you have some of these older records, at one point in time, Results went through and did an opening conversion that happened to help populate the maps, even though the maps were not the detail maps that the licensee provided for the opening. It doesn't have the standards unit boundaries and stuff. It was maps that were created or generated from a conversion process that took force cover, spatial information, and if the map sheet opening number matched, there was an attempt to generate the opening boundary. And some of the older records, you'll find that there's spatial information that lacks internal standards unit line work. So those are older records that can also exist in the system, but that was just an attempt to create the best available spatial for the opening to create an opening coverage. So what happens is that we do have information that are in the system, and if it's newer record post 2005, there's going to be a requirement for having spatial. Older stuff, you might see no spatial there, or sometimes you see spatial, but they don't look quite right, and that's because it was created from this conversion process. So what happens is that with dealing with SU modifications, the other things too that you need to be aware of is, like, this is where we're getting to the matrix of how you submit stuff through ESF. Different kinds of actions that you have available to you. When you're submitting your ESF file, you need to make sure you submit all your S standards unit as a part of the document. And then the way the Results ESF processing happens is that if some of those SUs are not included in your document, or if the nomenclature is different, it'll assume that you're deleting those SUs that are not included in the document. So that's an example of where the structure of how you set up your ESF file, depending on what you're trying to do in terms of what kind of changes you're making, will make a big difference. So there's certain assumptions with how the document is structured. And we'll talk about that in a lot more detail in ESF, but this is something that you have to be mindful of, the fact that there is some rigor with how the structure of the ESF file has to be set up. In the case of minor amendment and approved variation, ESF will allow you to submit only for the issue that you want to do updates to. And that matrix that I was showing you, that cheat sheet, provides you with a summary of all that. So there's a bunch of spatial rules that are in results. So what happens is that for records that exist in the system prior to this 2003 date, and this is sort of the creation of results. When it was pre-results, there was no spatial component in the predecessor system. But moving forward with results, because the spatial information became a requirement for submission, anything prior to that date, it's understood that information that exists there may be attribute only. And as I was saying before, there's openings that are in the system that are older, but then had undergone an opening spatial conversion. So you'll see in some situations there's maps that don't look exactly like the information that you expect to see for your opening files that you have in the office. But that's just because there was a generalization of boundary work that was done to create the opening coverage for results. And that's really because when results came into existence, for all the openings that existed at that point in time, and we're talking about like 186,000 records that existed for results, there was no spatial, so there was just no coverage for those records. So anything new coming in would have spatial coverage, but all the old stuff, there was nothing. So there was an attempt to take that forest cover information that existed in vegetation inventory, and if the map sheet number and opening numbers matched identically to that of results, then those forest cover polygons in veg inventory got merged to create the opening boundary, and that's what got placed into the SP map for results to create an opening coverage. From that one exercise done back in 2005, that created about a 68% coverage for opening boundary. And now we're at a stage where we get all these newer openings, and licensees are updating also some of the records if they're still active over time. So the coverage has improved many folds, like we're now around 87%. So that's just something that you have to be aware of. We do have some converted spatial coverage for opening, and so that's just there if you happen to see something a little bit irregular. But the idea here is that there's every opportunity to provide updated spatial should there be a need to do that. When we deal with also spatial rules, what happens is that there's different activities that you can make changes to, but there's no requirement for spatial updates. So one example of that is things like a minor amendment for silviculture prescription, where you're able to make changes to the BEC if there's improved BEC information, or the net area to be reforested. What happens is that there's improved precision, improved survey methodology, and there's area adjustments because there's just more, just improved survey work that's been done, and all you're doing is just making some minor area adjustments to the net area. And in that case, you're allowed to make the changes to the attribute only without having to supply full spatial. And so for moving forward, because we have this mandatory spatial component, mandatory ESF component now for all new records, any openings that have these opening category codes, and so anything that has an FT prefix is an open forest tenure opening category, and so it depends if it's a major licensee opening, a forest land management fund, FT levy, FSM is it's basically ones that are non-replaceable forest licenses, BCTS, and there's some Forest for Tomorrow ones. So these are opening categories where systematically, if you're creating a new opening, there will be a edit check to ensure that you are providing the SP map. And really, at the end of the day, what happens is that when we're doing any changes, standards unit changes, where you're making modifications to the boundaries, what happens is that the expectation is you have to do the submission through ESF, and you're going to provide that update with the map. So any questions about what I've presented so far? It's pretty straightforward, I think. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go into results, and just to show you, first of all, results homepage. So you should hopefully know how to get here. And really the key here is that the business documentation page has that results information submission specification that I referred to. So it's really important for you to know that this document is like the starting point for dealing with submissions for you if you're new to the business. And then the technical specification provides you with the ability to search out information about the information online. So this is where I refer to on the slide deck, where you have the ability of looking up online specifications, looking up the information for the screen that you might be having problems with, and find information about how that what is the purpose of the screen, how it functions, as well as edit rules that might be applying to that information if you're entering information and having problems with it. So the technical specification is a very useful source. So it's organized by screen, but there's also information by ESF schema elements, right? So so depending on what you're trying to do, you have the capability of looking up information about how different things are processed. And so it's really useful for me, but depending if you have problems, this is a go-to place to understand how information gets processed. So what I wanted to do is go into the application to show, whoops, see if I can get in here. I wanted to show you sort of just the genesis of some of those records that I was talking about so that you just have a sense of how they look in terms of the SP maps, because sometimes we do get calls about why some things look so strange. So this is production information, and I'm not really picking on any one licensee. It's just to illustrate the information that is in the system and how they appear based on different age and how different submissions have come through. So in this one example, it's an older record. These are like free growing openings now. But in this case, some of these older records, you'll see that there's no map, no SP map. So what happens is that these are older records that were created at a certain era where there's no mandatory spatial, and because it probably got declared free growing before results even, there's just no spatial available. So you will encounter situations like that. But for some of these records, depending on when it got declared free growing, if it had been supplied to results, if there's been updates that have happened to it in the force cover, for example, there's still no map because the declaration occurred back pre-2005. So you'll find that there's records that have no spatial whatsoever. So that's just important for you to understand that when you're using results information and spatial coverage format, that there's information that can exist that have no spatial in both either the opening or force cover. This other example that I have, what happens is that you could see here, it's free growing, and it was declared free growing probably pre-2005, but what you'll find is that there's no SP map because that when the map was supplied, when it was all paper-based, and there has been no subsequent changes to the standards unit since that point in time. But when you go to the force cover, the last update had occurred in 2013. So in this situation, the information had been provided in a mandatory spatial era, so we will have force coverage on this. So this is just to give you an example of information that can be missing from the SP map, in which case it does exist in a paper-based format in the district office. It's just that it won't be available as far as electronically in the results coverage. And then what I want to show is another older record that is in the system, where in this one situation we have this one opening. It's still older, it's declared free growing, but when you go into the map, you'll see that this standards unit actually, or this opening has 4 standards unit, but there is no internal line work for the standards unit. So if you were to look up this record and you look up the opening blob that's here, you'll see that if you look at the metadata, it will say something to the fact that it was a conversion that had occurred, and that's that conversion I talked about, where we pull the information from force cover, merge the line work to create and generate these SP maps. But it lacks detail for the standards unit because we're pretty much taking the information from force cover inventory. There's no reference to standards unit. So there's no way to be able to identify what standards unit boundaries look like. So this is an attempt to just create the coverage so that we can at least identify where the opening is, but there is no details about the standards unit. And so this record will remain as is. For some of these records you may come across with that kind of boundary, but in this case, if you're making changes to the standards unit and submitting an amendment, you have every opportunity to provide the spatial line work to update that with the more recent standards unit information that you have. So this is to just explain the fact that we do have these legacy converted openings that are in the system that may lack the details of what is in the standards unit boundaries. And if you choose to do that as part of your submission, if you want to, and if it's required, you can provide the submission through ESF and update the spatial. And then in the new world order, we have new openings that are coming in. And what happens is that with those, you are getting all the detailed information for the standards unit. So that's like an opening under the new standards that we have. And what happens is that if you go into the force cover information, you'll find that the force cover spatial is also provided. So I think the key here is that there's different kinds of spatial line work that are in the system, and the conversion ones that I talked about may also have different precision levels of what you may have in your system, and that's just because, again, it's information that was digitized by inventory, and so depending on the accuracy, depending on a whole number of different things, you'll find that if you were to look at the coverage that is on the SP map versus what is actually compared to the force cover, they may not align. And so this is just something that I want to make sure that you guys are aware of. So going back to my presentation. So the next, I talk about spatial just because, a lot of people find that, the spatial information doesn't look quite right, so people understand what has happened. So the next few slides, we're going to talk about the different types of actions that are available for making changes to standards unit. So this is getting into like the business context of what you may want to do to make changes to standards unit. So we have, in the silviculture prescription realm, we have corrections. And so corrections intended to make corrections to standards unit data, because prior to that 2005 point where it was pre-mandatory, the documents came through by paper, and what happened was that there were ministry people that would transcribe, enter in this information coming in through the forms. So there would be risk of data entry errors, and so in the process of now the ability for the licensee to see the results records themselves, they'll find that there's inconsistencies with the standards unit document that they have on their files versus the way it's reflected in results. So you can use the correction function to allow you to update the information and results to reflect the legal approved document that exists in the licensee's files. So for some of these records, you'll see, and we saw examples already, that these older records will not have online SP maps. unless it was converted through this opening spatial. So if it's still an active opening, if you see that there's errors, you have every opportunity to make changes to make those corrections, but also provide an update to the spatial information as well. So, but if you do want to make an update to the spatial information, then you have to do that through ESF. So that's the function of corrections. So it's only available for silviculture prescription. We also have minor amendments for silviculture prescription, where the intent of a minor amendment is to allow you to make area adjustments based on better information from field surveys. So you're not changing anything else for the standards unit stocking standards. It's really meant for just adjusting the BEC, the biogeoclimatic classification, or the net area to be reforested. So when I'm talking about this can actually be done through ESF or online. And then we also have the silviculture prescription amendment requiring approval. And so this document can be supplied through ESF or online, but much depends on whether or not you need to make changes to that map. So if you're getting into the changes of the standards unit where you're adding, deleting, or merging standards unit, or you're adjusting boundary work because of some other reason, then you need to provide that through ESF. But what happens here is that the silviculture prescription amendment requires approval, so it actually gets submitted, and there is it sits in an inbox in results for someone in the ministry's realm that has the approver role to review the amendment to either approve or not approve the amendment. So there's different steps involved for dealing with silviculture prescription amendment. There is the ability to do a Section 197 rollover, and what that is that under the provisions of FERPA, you have the ability of managing code openings, cut blocks, to be managed under FERPA stocking standards. But in order to do so, these cut blocks would have been identified in the FSP. And when the FSP is approved, essentially those cut blocks have been approved to be rolled over to be managed under the FERPA stocking standards. So results provides the formality of being able to then allow the application of those FSP stocking standards to those code silviculture prescription standards units. And then we have the standards units. We have site plans, and again, site plans and results are defined through the existence of that stocking standards ID. And what happens is that when we have a site plan, you have options of doing either approved variation, and what approved variation is that it's intended to make changes to stocking standards based on approved variations in the FSP. So what happens is that you have in the FSP, there's all these approved stocking standards, and sometimes some licensees write into their stocking standards specific approved variations for certain scenarios. It could be for terrain situations, damage agent concerns, wildlife, concerns. And so there's provisions to make slight variations to those stocking standards, but it's already predefined in their stocking standard. And what happens that when a standards unit when they encounter a standards unit where they need to do that approved variation, they're making those changes as per what has been already been identified as an approved variation in their FSP. So that's what approved variations are for. We also have site plan amendments, and what happens is that with site plan amendments, you're making changes. It could be adding, deleting, merging standards units, and what happens is that you can also apply different stocking standards, approved stocking standards ID to the standards unit. And then we also have the provision to do Section 197 rollovers as well for some code site plans. So in all the case of the site plan approved variation, site plan amendment, and Section 197 rollovers, there's no approvals required. So when the changes are done or made ESF or through online, if you enter the information or submit the ESF file and there's no issues as far as errors that come up, then what happens is that once it's been completed, it's deemed official, so there's no approvals required. While dealing with the Silviculture Prescription Amendment, corrections, minor amendment, and FERPA Section 197 rollover, again, if it's entered in, it's no edit errors come through, it's been accepted through ESF, or you're not encountering any errors. Once it's saved, it's official. The only thing that requires approval is the Silviculture Prescription Amendment. So that concludes what I wanted to talk about today about standards unit modification. It's very high level, and this afternoon and tomorrow we'll go through much more detail about doing SU modifications through ESF, as well as dealing with online SU modifications. So if you have questions, please type in your questions through your chat or use your microphone to ask your questions. If you have to go, I just want to point to you our help resource information that we have on our website as well. There's questions and answers you can look up. You may want to also ask questions through your district results contact, and if you're involved with dealing with submitting for Silviculture Prescription Amendment, then you'll actually be, you might want to find out who your district counterpart is that's in the approver role, so that if you need to follow up with any submitted documents that are sitting in the inbox and you need to just to do follow-up on its status, then you can look up who that district ministry contact is. And if you do run into problems where you're not able to resolve on your own through the question answer or the local contact you have, or the technical specification documents, then you can contact our application help people, and they will respond to you. And if you need to attend any other sessions, or you're not able to attend any sessions but need to review materials to complete the test, the materials are all located on our on the training website. There's PowerPoints and also recordings are available. So I am going to, I guess, offer any, do you have any questions you might want me to try to see if I can answer? And